Welcome to this incident response webinar, and welcome back to those of you who have already been to some of them this morning, and this is the first one this afternoon. This is Tackling Financial Incidents from Mishcon de Reya, and this afternoon's presentation is from Joe Hancock and Mark Tibbs, and I'll hand you over to them to start the presentation. You can ask some questions in the question panel at the end, which we will, you can type them in at any point during the presentation, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation.
So I'm Joe Hancock. I'm a partner at Mishcon de Reya. Mishcon de Reya is a law firm, but I'm not a lawyer. We're unique in having a practice made up of non-lawyers who work alongside our legal colleagues. So we'll give you a bit of an overview of some of the tools and techniques that we have picked up along the way that help us manage financial crime incidents. My background's in cybersecurity and incident response about the last kind of 15 years, and I'll let my colleague Mark Tibbs introduce himself.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks Joe. I'm Mark Tibbs. I'm the Director of Intelligence at MDR Cyber, part of Mishcon de Reya. My background, I spent the last 10 years working in the field of cyber investigations, really. I spent 8 years at the National Crime Agency in their intelligence function and 3 years at a threat intelligence startup. A lot of my work at Mishcon involves both CTI but also traditional investigations, so it's a very much a blend of the two disciplines.
Brilliant, thanks Mark. So today we just wanted to talk through a couple of lessons that we've learned in tackling financial crime incidents over the past few years. We sit in a slightly privileged position right at the kind of nexus of where kind of technical cyber meets crime. A lot of our work, is in that kind of cyber crime space. We tend to get involved in incidents for clients wherever there's a financial angle, be it that maybe it's ransomware and a large ransom needs to be kind of paid or defended, or maybe we're looking at business email compromise where there's been a redirection of funds. And so today we'd just like to share a couple of lessons that we've learned over the years, which we battling name. We believe you can kind of fight fire with explosives, and that following the money is a useful thing to do. So we're going to take some of the kind of technical things around incidents as read and try and show how some of the crime side of cybercrime works and what we kind of look at.
So we come across lots of different types of cyber-enabled frauds, but in particular we've dealt with several investment frauds in the last few years. And this is a diagram from a report that we put together at the end of last year, but it explains the sequence of events that we've seen in a typical investment fraud. So these are frauds which are impersonating financial services companies, typically targeting victims who are members of the general public, usually, unfortunately, vulnerable or old, with pension pots to invest. The typical structure of these kinds of frauds, it follows a really familiar pattern that we've seen. So it starts off with the fraudsters setting up websites and shell companies that are associated to those websites, and they also create they also pay for keywords to improve rankings in the search engines, and they typically present themselves as brokers or providing sort of investment services. And then at the same time, they've set up bank accounts, either using unwitting or witting mules to facilitate their frauds. And then you'll find the victims are, usually vulnerable people are trying to find websites using search engines. They're using phrases such as high yield investments and things like that, entering their personal details into these websites, which are then being harvested by the criminals in order to complete their deception. And the deceptions, they use sort of cyber-enabled fraud techniques like using typo-squatted domains. So we find the deception is usually sort of fairly long, drawn out to try and gain trust with the victims. It might be contacting them via phone initially, and then developing a relationship with them, sending them brochures that are using the intellectual property of our clients, of the financial services companies. And enacting that fraud to appear credible and gain the confidence of their victims. And then, unfortunately, the upshot of it is that you find the victims are sending large amounts of money to fictitious bank or fictitious sort of investment opportunities. These can be blue chip investment opportunities. They could be things like solar panels. We've seen a range of different lures in order to get victims to pay, but typically it involves a very high level of return, or sort of exceedingly high levels of return that you're not seeing at the moment with very, very low interest rates. And then the attackers are then laundering the proceeds of their crime, usually through a sort of multi-jurisdictional laundering chain. So we're finding bank accounts in offshore jurisdictions are being used in order to take away those funds and monetize them. And really, these groups they're organized crime groups. These are fraudsters who have developed their trade over a long period of time.
Thanks, Mark. And it's worth saying that the reason we relate this back to organised crime is because that every time we've investigated one of these frauds, especially this particular one, we find ourselves speaking to the same fraudsters on the phone, and we've started to be able to link some personalities to what we think is a UK organised crime group. We also see others that are more international. And interesting, this is a confidence trick from more traditional crime, effectively moved online. Interestingly enough, the fraudsters managed to actually make quite a return on this by, when somebody provided the first payment, they would actually pay some of the money, the victim's money, back to them, saying, here's your first interest payment, look at the return you're making. And therefore the victim, unfortunately, then would kind of go all in and would provide a large amount of funds to the fraudsters. And we've seen this kind of fraud crop up several times. The other interesting angle of it, that the fraudsters, whilst being traditional kind of frauds, as I call it, not necessarily some of the other cybercrime incidents we deal with that are kind of cyber first, the fraudsters have been very careful to hide detection. So, for example, the intellectual property misuse only really occurs in the middle of the chain. Once you've actually engaged with the fraudster, it's very difficult just to go and look for a typo-squatted domain or to go and conduct any kind of collection to look for these attacks, because the fraudster doesn't almost reveal themselves properly, pretending to be a regulated entity, until you're actually in kind of telephone contact with them. All of the keywords and websites from this fraud that we saw at the front end of it, once we finally found the kind of 20 or 30 sites that were driving people into the fraud, none of those contains any kind of intellectual property or keywords that you really could pick up unless you knew there was a fraudster behind it. As this put us in an interesting situation, because this is a fraud against members of the public, some of whom are vulnerable. There is this was we've had those for a couple of clients, the same group, where their intellectual property is being misused. And the issue here is that as we begin to investigate one of these frauds, using our traditional incident response process that we'd use for other incidents, doesn't really work, because the linear nature of that process means that as we continue to investigate and we try and, for example, we try to deal with some of the domain names, and perhaps we try and deal with some of the traditional areas of the fraud, so of the infrastructure, more victims are falling foul of the fraudster. And so the linear kind of process means that by the end of it, where you find the person responsible, you've had several victims along the way. And here we found one of the main issues is that actually there's only weak signals with these kind of frauds at first. You don't see a kind of a traditional report. There's no real evidence to look for. And we borrowed some concepts here from what's called precursor resilience. This is, where when you see a weak signal, when you see that first report on social media, maybe you have someone, as happened in this case, contact your sales desk, and they're surprised that they're dealing with you and you haven't heard of them. Overreacting to those first signals actually puts you in a very good place. Very easy to say, because obviously people are very resistant to that. We found that the first signs of these frauds are very, very weak. It's not entirely obvious. The other thing that we found works these frauds is borrowing some concepts from law enforcement, in particular the kind of fraud investigations model. And really, what this means is actually, as well as following the usual linear incident response process, considering very, very early on in the process options to disrupt and enforce against the perpetrators of the fraud. And by that, we mean tackling the infrastructure. So, for example, the key to stopping this fraud here really was a kind of multi-pronged approach of having the Google AdWords removed, getting the websites and domains taken down, launching a cease and desist enforcement action against the shell companies that are being used, closing the bank accounts. The more quickly you can remove the infrastructure that supports the fraud, the sooner there will be less victims. There's still a level of investigation required. There's still the traditional checks and balances that need to be in place to make sure that this isn't an internal problem, it is just external, these kind of things. But the more quickly you can disrupt this kind of incident, the sooner things kind of stop. And we've used a range of tools over the years to do that, from having bank accounts frozen if we suspect that they are being used for the proceeds of crime, which we'll talk a bit about when we talk about following the money, through to quite aggressive domain takedowns. And this is a box of tools that it's not completely risk-free. You need to know what you're doing with them, and they're not for every kind of not for every scenario. But we think they should form a useful part of every incident responder's kind of toolbox. So Mark, if you have any thoughts about the disruptive tools that can be used.
Yeah, as Joe said, the way that we have tackled this in the past is to identify, map out infrastructure, and then take action against the infrastructure. And it can be domains, it can be telephone numbers, it can be supporting services as well if they're using website website hosting services and things like that. And whilst that may not stop the fraudsters altogether, what we have found is that it sort of quickly disrupts them enough and frustrates them enough that they tend to move on to other targets, which is obviously important for our clients, that they're no longer targeting them, and it may mean that it's displaced to somewhere else. But the disruption and frustration that it brings with it is enough to sort of like hopefully protect a few more victims in the process, and also give what the investigations yield. We're able sometimes to adapt some of our disclosure orders, for example, to provide to the police in order to assist with their investigations as well. So there's losses that we can recover, but there's also sort of criminal enforcement action that can be taken off the back of it.
Thanks, Mark. And while we set out a scenario here that kind of sits separately from a traditional incident response investigation, we find that when dealing with things such as business email compromise in particular, that actually just focusing on the technical investigation, so how did the attackers get in, where did they move to internally, what data was accessed, again, using these disruptive tools very early on to take down domains, stop bits of the attack kind of occurring, it is a useful set of tools to consider right up front. And so we always like to put disruption right alongside containment as another set of containment options. And that brings me on quite nicely to talk about our next set of area, which is following the money. And Mark, if you want to talk through how we see financial pivots occur.
Yeah, sure. So as with the investment fraud example, there's a point where fraudsters will pivot into taking the money away from their victims, and that occurs as well in business email compromise frauds. Usually there's a prolonged kind of usually there's an interception of communications, and there's a point where the attackers will introduce their own banking details to their victims, and then sort of encourage using things like urgency, and usually encourage their victims to make a payment. And it's at that point really where the rapid investigation and following that chain is critical to making to getting the best outcomes when you're investigating it. So I think, Joe, you'll talk about in the next slide, there's a kind of critical period for that, and we know that we know that the quicker you act, the more likely you are in order to be able to make a recovery. But at that point, we are considering, if we're investigating, it's at that point that we're considering things like injunctive measures. We're considering disclosure orders on banks. We're considering disclosure orders on domain registrars to get more information, to identify the wrongdoers, to identify the losses. And working with our lawyers and our investigators, we'll be working really hard to establish the facts of the case, to put that into applications for court orders. We'll be looking at the chain of laundering that's going on at that point. So we may get a disclosure order against a bank which tells us that the money's been put into usually another UK bank account, and then there's been an onward dissipation of assets, typically places like Hong Kong offshore jurisdictions where we're seeing lots of the funds being removed from the UK jurisdiction. But yeah, it's at that point, and critically quickly, we want to do an investigation, we want to establish the facts, and we want to be able to then take legal action in order to disrupt, to get more information, to find the wrongdoers, and put pressure on either the attackers or in fact the banking institutions themselves to make recoveries and freeze assets.
Thanks, Mark. So one of the key things we've found with this kind of attack is what we kind of first of all call the financial pivot. This is, again, as part of business email compromise, where the attacker effectively would move laterally, looking for where there are transactions that can be intervened in. Let's kind of call it that. We've seen redirected insurance premiums. We've seen typical redirection, conveyancing house purchases. We've seen internal intercompany transfers and intra-company transfers of funds, ranging from anything from very small amounts for someone paying some fees for a conference, in one example, to multi-million pound frauds for maybe it's a very large house or a business transaction. And the reason that financial pivot happens is because it's that is ultimately what the attacker is looking for. We often don't see data exfiltration alongside these attacks. It is a pure play kind of financial crime. The interesting thing we've found over the past kind of few years of doing this is where we can take immediate action within 24 hours, we find that we have a 95% approximately chance of kind of financial recovery. So we kind of call this the golden 24 hours. If we can get into the banking system at that point, we have a really, really good chance of getting the money back. And for example, I mentioned the £2 million fraud. We dealt with a fraud interception effectively as a business email compromise for 2.27 million. Within 24 hours, we'd recovered 2 million of that. And then over the subsequent days, recovered nearly all of the rest, apart from 27k that had unfortunately in that instance made it to Hong Kong. A few top tips for doing this. If you are the responder inside a company, make sure you have a good relationship with your bank, and also make sure that you can mobilize your bank to talk to other banks. The reason I say that is because as a responder, you would think that, say you're banking with Acme Bank and the money's gone from Acme Bank to International Bank, you actually have no relationship with International Bank. That money went from Acme Bank, from you to Acme Bank, from Acme Bank to International Bank. The International Bank isn't actually going to talk to you. So you need to be able to mobilize your bank to push things into that chain, as well as potentially trying to explain the situation to banks further down the chain who actually have no relationship with you. And here the interesting tension is those banks have a relationship with the account holder. They need to put their customers' interests first, and they're always trying to balance the potential for what is suspected fraud. There's no evidence of it necessarily at this point in time, and their account holder's rights. And they're very worried about closing or flagging an account which could be being used legitimately, and maybe the report of fraud is false. And again, one of our kind of top tips there is really to, as well as moving quickly, is to use money laundering regulation to help your kind of case. Once you can show that a criminal act has occurred, and once you can provide some evidence of that fraud, rather than explaining to those intermediary banks that actually now that there's a suspected fraud, if you explain that they're holding the proceeds of crime, all of the good money laundering regulation then kicks in, and we find that you're likely to get a much more responsive and friendly attitude from those kind of organisations. So top tip there would always be going down, this is the proceeds of crime, not just we've seen a suspected fraud, because actually when you get into the banking world, those actually mean different things. Another top tip for implementing this in an organisation, again, if you're looking at more proactive risk work, the group of people who manage finance within your organisation, they create a high risk group of people and processes. Always worth making sure there's extra controls around those people, but they're also well worth bringing them into the incident response process. We've had great success working with clients where their treasury teams have had great relationships with their banks, and because of that have been able to mobilise their bank to do things for us within that kind of golden 24 hours, which ultimately really, really helps keep things going. So that was everything that we wanted to talk through in detail. Happy to take some kind of questions, or Mark and I can perhaps share some more examples of how we've seen these things work in practice and the tools and techniques that have worked for us. Please, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat.
Thank you, Mark and Joe there. That was really interesting. And I'm sure there are people that have got some questions out there. So please feel free to pop those into the question pane now. We have a few minutes for Joe and Mark to answer those questions for you. So it is the time to do this, I am sure. However, if you do go away and you suddenly think of those burning questions, you can see on the slide there that you've got both Joe and Mark's details, so you can contact them, and please feel free to come through to the marketing@crest-approved.org email if you have any questions, and we're sure to pass those on. But yeah, it was, I mean, it's really interesting there too, and I think with the tips of what to do, and I think the thing that I grasped really from that was that you do have to be incredibly fast moving, don't you, to make sure that money just doesn't disappear.
Yeah, you're completely right. We find within 24 hours that you've got a kind of a 95% chance of recovery. Over the next 30 days, you then kind of go down in effectively kind of diminishing returns. You can sometimes make recoveries after that kind of point. You know, we've been very lucky before, for example, where we've frozen the bank account and then more criminal funds have landed in the same account later on down the line. And ultimately, with some of these attacks where we're dealing with, you know, we can trace this back to a particular group or individuals, we'll always look actually to take it as far as we can and to seize assets or to hold somebody to account via a kind of criminal prosecution. Ultimately, that's easier when we're dealing with cyber criminals that are closer to home. There's some jurisdictions it's very hard to do that in. But yeah, speed is absolutely of the essence when the traditional banking system's involved. Slightly different if we see payments in cryptocurrency and other things, as we have with kind of ransomware attacks. Again, if it goes near an exchange, we can treat that like a bank. But for most of them, some of them are less easy to deal with. But then if it's cryptocurrency funds that it just sits in a wallet somewhere, we ultimately have to play a bit of a waiting game over time. Again, and it's interesting sometimes because the 24 hours of financial recovery can also clash with some of your other obligations, such as, you know, your 72-hour reporting obligation from the Information Commissioner's Office. So we always view this as a step in the road. It's not the only thing to do. You need to be thinking about your other obligation as well. But yeah, no, absolutely, speed is of the essence. If you can get in there in the first 24 hours, act really decisively, make sure you take action, because then, you know, you can also then explain to customers, clients, and victims that you have. Yeah, so it's useful to show you're doing the right thing, but also ultimately it will have absolute financial benefit. You know, if you think about the 2.27 million incident I talked about, that therefore became a much smaller incident. It was a business email compromise, and the costs were just what was required for the forensic investigation and some security improvements, not all of that, and having to replace the multi-million loss. So yeah, very important to be quick.
One of the questions we typically get asked when we're talking about this sort of thing is how do the police fit into this? Because you know, that might seem like an obvious question to ask when you're dealing with sort of massive cybercrime fraud, but in the case of the investment fraud, certainly you've got in isolation incidents that can be quite small. They can, you know, in the grand scheme of things, the losses can be, you know, thousands, which is obviously a lot to an individual, but to a police force who are dealing with multi-million-pound frauds and an increasing burden of fraud because of the economic conditions that COVID-19 has presented. You know, we've sort of seen a 45% increase in reporting, I think, between beginning of March and June, I think, this year, and it's sustained in the UK. So police forces are dealing with an awful lot of fraud investigations, and sometimes it just doesn't hit their priorities in isolation. Now we know that having investigated some of these frauds, they can be, you know, they can be in aggregate. The losses can be very big, and so we are, you know, whenever we're doing these investigations, we're making sure to try and share that information where we can with the police so that they can take action. But yeah, typically it's you know, these criminals are smart and they realise that they can stay under the radar.
Yeah, and as you said there, I mean, you brought the police into it, and obviously earlier you were talking about the banks as well, and it's about having everybody in that chain really all working effectively together, and that can sometimes be quite difficult, can't it, from that point of view?
No, completely. I mean, you know, the more stakeholders you have to manage, the more complex something is. I mean, you know, you're already with a large one of these incidents already coordinating quite a few people, and also there's a regulatory angle to it as well. You know, the regulator is going to have expected you to have taken some of this action, but also expect to be told about it. So yeah, you know, we often find that one of our roles is to act as that, you know, kind of stakeholder manager, to give the technical team the kind of top cover they need to get on and to do the things they need to let the lawyers do the things they need to, and to have someone kind of manage the sometimes conflicting relationships as well, because law enforcement will have a different view than potentially our legal colleagues would have, and our legal colleagues will have a different view than the regulator might have. And so, and ultimately, there's usually an organisation who has their own view in the middle there. So somewhere between all those, it is the right answer. And you're right, managing all those stakeholders is difficult. But again, we always say this, you know, fortune favours the prepared. And every kind of pound you spend on preparation in advance pays off exponentially when you have one of these incidents. So making sure that, you know, as part of the incident response process, either with your incident response provider or as part of your incident response planning, get those stakeholders in the room, test that this stuff works, make sure the bank understands that you're going to come to them and what you might say, work out who your contact at the bank is, even just having their email address and phone number for your account manager. If you need it in an emergency, it is a great thing to do. So that definitely helps the coordination, because then there's a certain level of goodwill you can rely on to kind of smooth over some of those stakeholder relationships. But no, you're completely right, it gets complex quickly.
Yeah, that's lovely. Thank you very much. So we've just had another question in, so I'd like to get that one in just before we finish, because I know we're nearing time. So what do you think the next big trend in cyber-enabled, cyber-dependent fin crime in the near future will be?
Well, I'll let Mark handle this one, as we wrote an entire report on this in December. So.
Yeah, well, I mean, so we're yeah, like I said earlier, we're definitely going to see, I mean, we've already seen increases in fraud reporting in the UK and elsewhere, and that is just as expected because of economic conditions. I suppose, I mean, you know, it would be obvious to say that big game ransomware was going to be a huge problem this year, and that's going to continue, no doubt about that. I suppose there might be some green shoots on the horizon because there's a lot more regulation in place around sort of ransomware payments. So maybe we'll see, I mean, maybe we'll see, this isn't necessarily a trend in the criminality, but I think trend in enforcement's going to change. So I think we're going to see inaction of sanctions against people that are paying ransoms. That is going to happen in this year or next year. I'm pretty sure we're going to see fines against victims who have paid. I'm not casting. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but it's certainly going to happen because you've seen the EU and you've seen the US announce sanctions regimes against, you know, and underline their sanctions regimes against ransomware groups. So I think, yeah. Probably you're going to see a change in the way, and that will affect the behavior of ransomware groups, I suppose. I doubt it will take away their emboldenedness, if that's even a word. But what it might do is it might create conditions that are more difficult for businesses to pay, which hopefully will have a sort of quelling effect on ransomware, I suppose. In terms of investment fraud, you're just going to see loads more of it, and you're going to see in the UK in particular, enforcement unable to deal with the sheer volumes of it, I think. You know, it probably, as far as businesses are concerned, they should be thinking about that as in their planning for 2021 and beyond 2025.
Yeah, I think that's right, Mark. The key message we always give to clients is that the big trend we see at the moment is not necessarily crime that affects you, but crime that uses you to affect other people, because it's some of the most difficult to deal with, some of the most difficult to detect. And that's definitely a growing trend we see. There's just going to be more of this, unfortunately, because of the economic conditions we find ourselves in.
That's great, thank you very much. And sorry if we didn't get round to one of your questions, apologies, but unfortunately we have run out of time for today. Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation. I definitely found it interesting, and I know our attendees will have done as well. We have had a comment about, obviously, them getting hold of the report link in the State of Cybercrime report. So we can make sure that that gets sent round to attendees, so everybody gets a chance to have a look at that. And as I say, Joe and Mark have got their email addresses up there, so please feel free to contact them, because I'm sure they will answer any questions that you have. So thank you very much to the both of you. I'll just hand over to you to just say a last couple of words.
I know. Thank you very much for having us. And again, if anyone would like to reach out to us, please do. Well, LinkedIn, social media, email, phone, whatever you prefer. And if you'd like to download the report, so the link's there. We're always happy to chat through this stuff with people. So yeah, it'd be great to hear from you. And huge thank you to CREST for today. Great opportunity, and yeah, hope to do it again.
Oh, it was great to have you both. Thank you very much, and take care, and everybody else have a good rest of the day. We still have got some presentations running through this afternoon, so please feel free to get onto those. So take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.